So thanks so much, Chuck, for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure, man.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we've both, Will and I, have been obviously following your work for a long time. Really appreciate getting to talk to you on here. I thought a really good kind of jump off point is just to find out a little bit more about you. You've really dabbled in a lot of different areas of research in psychiatry, and I know you're researching psilocybin now, whole body heat, and got brain connection stuff, and just so many different really cutting edge areas. I'm really curious to hear a little bit about your personal story of what's getting
how this all happened.
How is this all happening for you?
Yeah. People come to me for advice. A lot of people that are like docs, because I'm a doctor. I'm an MD and a psychiatrist, and so people come sort of wanting to know, well, how can I get into research? And the first thing I tell them is, don't ever do what I did. It just was this crazy combination of mostly luck and timing, and because I've been in a bunch of different academic sort of locations in my life, and sometimes I've really prospered, and sometimes I haven't prospered, and it's a testimony to the fact that I've had this very odd sort of path through things that is not something that you'd ever want to try to repeat. So I was a journalist. And initially, I wanted to be a novelist, and I actually packed up and moved to Denver. So I was in you guys' neck of the woods in the early 80s, discovered that I had no talent for writing novels whatsoever, and sort of had this revelatory experience. Literally one day, it was Christmas Eve, 1984. I was on a road down in Texas, and I had been going through a really tough time in my personal life, a breakup of a marriage, and had gone into psychotherapy for the first time, and had really been impacted by it. And I had this flash: I could be a psychiatrist. I could go to medical school and become a psychoanalyst, And I made this absolutely spur of the moment decision. That's what I'm going to do. And then I had to figure out, how did I go back and take my science classes? And I ended up having to do a post-bac program, and barely got into medical school because people thought I was crazy because I was a journalist. I didn't have any science background, but, did well and ended up at UCLA, still sort of thinking I wanted to be a therapist. Went through residency, discovered I didn't like therapy. Actually, I don't have the patience for it. And was really, I ran the emergency service at UCLA. So I was seeing all the really, really severely psychotic, mentally ill people. And that's where it was. But I had always sort of had this sort of underground interest in spiritual stuff. I'm not particularly religious, but, I guess I'm like a lot of people. I have the urge and not the certainty. But I had this sort of long connection with Buddhist thought. And in the mid-90s, I'd finally gotten old enough where some of these core, very straightforward Buddhist ideas about the mind really struck me. I saw it myself. So I started hanging out at a Tibetan Buddhist monastery down in Southern California, just casually. And through a long series of crazy things, they asked me. Eventually, I ended up hosting a big fundraising dinner for the Dalai Lama's sister at UCLA. So I got to know the Dalai Lama's sister, and we kind of hit it off. And she introduced me to these Tibetan Buddhist monks that were working in Western environments. And so I began to sort of crash course, just sort of hanging out at dinner with these guys. They taught me a lot of stuff about esoteric Tibetan Buddhist, especially tantric practices. And I became, kind of oddly obsessed with some of their practices that manipulated thermoregulatory pathways in the body to produce these profound sort of euphoric mental states. And don't ask me why. I don't know. There was one in particular called Tumo that I became so obsessed with that I said, I want to study this from a Western perspective. These guys are onto something. They're doing something to manipulate their body to produce these changes in their brain. And my buddy in those years, Lobsang Ropge, a brilliant Tibetan sort of philosopher and doctor and Western psychologist, made a comment that really was the launch of my career. He said, Chuck, the reason that sutra mindfulness practices take like trillions of years to produce enlightenment in our system is because the mind is so insubstantial and flighty. Good luck trying to control it, right? On the other hand, tantric practices harness bodily energies. Now, they had a very different idea of what bodily energies are, but very clearly these sort of bodily energies, you manipulate them. And when you do that, you can drive the mind into these sort of fixed states that are hard to assail, either with mental activity or things happening in the world. They basically produce these fixed, in this case, sort of blissful, euphoric states. And I was seeing a lot of very sick manic patients at the time. And so my initial interest was like, whoa, these guys have figured out a way to make people manic. If we can understand how you use the body to produce these states, maybe we'd learn something about that. But over time, it morphed into this idea that perhaps bodily processes represented something akin to deep brain stimulators, things that might be harnessed to put the brain in more stable, positive mood states. That one sentence, that was a sentence that launched 1,000 ships for me. So I said, I got to do this. UCLA was not a conducive environment in those years for that kind of work for a guy like me, who had no particular training in research. So I packed up and moved to Emory University in Atlanta, and was fortunate to fall in with, I think, really the world's leader in the psychoneuroimmunology world, certainly in the psychiatrists' perspective, Andrew Miller, and a remarkable Tibetan Buddhist studies program led by my very close friend and colleague, Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Nagy. And I retrained. I became a scientist of sorts. I really only was able to do that because I'd been a journalist. I knew how to write. And so I knew how to write up other people's ideas, in particular Andy Miller's, which I shamelessly stole. And that was it. So then I began to do this research, began to get grants. But always, you're right that I've done all this stuff, but there's always been this sort of theme behind it, a couple of themes. One is sort of, what is the role of consciousness in human well-being, and what are and how do mind-body or brain-body interactions, how do they play into that, and how can bodily processes be accessed to sort of change conscious experience? Really, if you look at my work, almost all of it circulates around just those couple of ideas.
That's a great. I love your story.
Great strange story.
It's a good strange,
like I say,
long strange trip, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to ask a different question. I always love where these things go. I'd love to hear your thoughts with everything you're studied and where you started on what is consciousness. What is your take on that with everything you know at this point?
Well, okay, so this is really interesting. I have gotten more and more interested in that question over the last 5 years. And the reason being, of course, is because so let me if you'll bear with me, I'll back up for a sec. So, I started my career because I was interested in trying to study these esoteric Tibetan practices from a Western perspective. So I always had this bias that people had discovered these potential things a long time ago, that sort of low-hanging fruit, things you could do to produce these very powerful sort of psychological states. And so as I did all the psychoneuroimmunology and all this, I began to realize that a lot of these ancient practices tapped into these things we've been talking about. And so I began to study them, like you mentioned, heat, hyperthermia. And so, about 5 years ago, I fell into an opportunity to get involved with the psilocybin work. And of course, although that's not a bodily practice per se, it's definitely an ancient practice, right? People have been doing this for thousands of years. So that's how I kind of morphed into the psilocybin work, was this interest in sort of recuperating or retooling ancient practices for the treatment of depression. But psilocybin, it seems very clear from the data we have thus far that it works by inducing these really shocking, surprising, powerful, immediate psychological experiences that people then, that there's something about the experiencing of those experiences that often change people, right? And so, of course, this gets really interesting then, because, these are conscious experiences. And so we should already know that consciousness might have relevance to mental illness or mental health, because post-traumatic stress disorder clearly is a disorder where something happens to you. You have a conscious, horrible, surprising, uncontrollable experience, and then you're different afterwards. And there's some data, to suggest that if you block sort of conscious awareness of the trauma, you reduce the risk of PTSD. So it shouldn't be surprising that like psychedelics produce sort of the same thing in reverse, shocking, powerful, surprising, out of your control, but in this case, positive. So I and my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin have gotten really interested in this question of, wow, so psychedelics might serve as a probe to understand Um, the induction, the reliable induction of conscious states that might have this real therapeutic potentials, and also a way to see, well, maybe consciousness, whatever we mean by that, has the ability to actually interact with matter in a reentrant way and change people. Well, this is an ancient philosophical problem and question. But we decided we've been working on a study, which we haven't started yet, but we're pretty far along in getting it set up, especially before COVID, where we're going to actually try to take people that are depressed and give them psilocybin and see if we remove the conscious experience, does it still work as an antidepressant? So when we started working on this study that we call the RECAP study, we realized that we didn't quite know what we meant by consciousness, right? So right now, you're conscious, you have a sense, right? People, say nobody knows what consciousness is, but the definition is often something like what it feels like to be something, to be somewhere. You have a sense that there's an awareness here, right? When we're awake or in dreams, that sense is always with us. Interestingly, though, we don't remember most of what we've experienced in our lives. But there is another aspect of consciousness, which is memory and narrative reconstruction, right? So, a lot of who we think we are and a lot of how we interpret the world at this moment has to do with what we've experienced in the past. And, some of that is programmed unconsciously. But a lot of it's conscious. I see a certain thing and I go, oh, that reminds me of when, and it changes my present, right? So consciousness has these two aspects, what they call phenomenal consciousness, which is just the simple sense that you have a sense of awareness at the moment, and access consciousness, which is the consciousness that you can consciously access memories and those sorts of things. So, I think that whatever it is, consciousness is some combination of those things. And so, we're going to basically, first we're going to remove the memory and see whether it still works if people can't remember their psychedelic experience, around this idea of literally testing, if you can't remember it, and if you cannot remember it and it works, it suggests either that raw basic consciousness at the time is doing the trick, or that it's just basically, a sort of deeper level biological thing. The consciousness gets thrown off like smoke out the back of a car. On the other hand, if you can't remember your psychedelic experience and you say, I don't feel any different, I don't know what you did to me, that would really suggest there's something about the memory, that part of sort of access consciousness, that is key for this particular therapeutic intervention, but also perhaps for certain types of transformation. Now, there's a complexity, though, which is, as we started working on this, it's very, very difficult to say. So let's say that just the conscious experience that you have during a psychedelic experience is enough. You don't have to remember it. Is it the awareness? Is it this immaterial factor that's doing it? Or is it the brain changes that produce that factor? And trying to figure that out is very difficult. So it's really interesting when you try to test consciousness. It's very, very hard to separate the neurobiology from the phenomenology, right? So really all I think we are trying to do at this point is say, well, there may be a neurobiology that is mandatory, that manifests as consciousness. But, you start getting into these circles that are really, really complicated, but really, really cool. Long answer, sorry, to your question.
I'm sure you have no, I think it's a great place to go. I'm sure, Will, you have some burning questions from this. I love this rabbit hole. I mean, I'm all going into, well, how do we even know, just because we remove memory, that we're removing the phenomenological experience?
Well, you're not. Well, we don't know. You're not removing the experience as it happened at the time, right? And you may not be removing unconscious elements of it, right?
Right.
Of course, but then unconscious. But if we're interested in consciousness, you've at least removed some of that, right? But you see, you begin to think about it. I mean, I came into this. It's a really simple, straightforward idea, right? People go, oh, that's interesting, but you start digging, and it gets complicated really fast, right? I mean, it's a really interesting. Consciousness is sort of this great. The more I've read about it, the more I'm just befuddled by the mystery of it, right? It is the one thing, I mean, Descartes was probably right about this. It's the one thing we know for sure, right? The one thing you can claim to know for sure is your conscious experience just by tautologically, because you're having that conscious experience. Now, the experience is almost certainly not what you think it is. It's not continuous. It's not as solid, but there's something there, right? And that, past that, everything else is supposition, right? I mean, this is the old phenomenologist's argument, right? That, you may exist, I guess, I mean, I'm talking to you, but you act like you exist, right? But I'm not really sure about that. And you act like you're conscious, but, you could be really a super smart bot, So, right, I mean, so on the one hand, consciousness seems unfindable by science and has been often relegated to being this sort of worthless epiphenomenon. And on the other, when you get down to it from a certain angle, it's the only thing that is actually real that we can know. And by the way, since we're talking about this, I've gotten really interested. I have a colleague at University of Wisconsin named Giulio Tononi, who is probably the world's most important consciousness researcher right now. He's the originator of something called integrated information theory. And the reason I'm thinking of him is the work is very mathematical, way beyond me. But he starts with this idea. It's really interesting. So most scientists say, well, let's understand the structure of the brain and maybe that'll tell us something about consciousness. He reversed it. He said, let's start with the structure of consciousness and see if we can identify structures in the brain that would be able to manifest that phenomenon. It's really fascinating, right? It totally turns it on its head, and it's gotten a lot of traction. I mean, Templeton's put in $10 million to test the theory versus a much more sort of, starting with a biology-based theory. So it's just really interesting stuff.
Wow. There's so many different rabbit holes we could go down.
I know. Many.
It's wonderful to have you. I feel like you've been one of my idols for a long time, Chuck, and it's just it's wonderful to get to share some time and pick your brain here. Hear a little bit about how things work. I guess one question that comes up for me, sort of like the issue, I guess this leads into, for me, the issue of healing depression and the role of consciousness, or maybe, and this might be a separate phenomenon, but the role of remodeling thinking patterns. Mm-hmm. And then this other area of your research in the past, anyway, of looking at the role of inflammation, the role of supporting cells in the brain, astrocytes, microglia, and how it all fits together. I guess I'm wondering if you could speak to that in terms of your current perspective about.
Yeah, sure. So the microglia, the question of neurons and microglia, I try to stay out of the brain to the best of my ability. So unfortunately, that also means that I have a lot less expertise in those areas. Although certainly I think one of the surprising things in affective neuroscience over the last 15, 20 years has been this sort of realization that the abnormalities, the generalized abnormalities you see in the brains of depressed people tend to cluster more around glial cells than neurons, right? I mean, we always thought of glial as glue, that these were just sort of supportive structure cells. I mean, that's clearly not true now, right? I love this idea that neurons are essentially digital, which allows them to send messages rapidly and with fidelity over longer distances, but that more localized information processing in the brain is a lot of it's done by astrocytes, which are sort of analog in their information processing. So you get this sort of cool mixture of analog and digital, which, if artificial intelligence ever produces sort of cyborgian things that are part human, part machine, they will build upon some idea like that, right? Where you analog, it may be that the analog nature of the brain is part of what contributes to its ability, the human ability to have consciousness. It's been this, not to digress on this, but real quickly, I've kind of got a hobbyist interest in artificial intelligence, and, there's this assumption that consciousness and intelligence are inextricably linked, but it's clearly not true, right? That, when Tononi and I talk about this, one of the things we talk about is the very real potential future of super intelligent creatures, but nothing home, right? There's no lights on anymore, no felt sense of what it's like to be that. But way smarter than we are, way better to solve problems, which to me is one of the scariest of all future scenarios, kind of the AI zombie world. But it may be actually that the glial cells and that sort of analogy nature of things is doing something, contributing to the fact that evolved nervous systems have as this sort of quality of theirs that purely digital things don't have. So interesting. And of course, there's a real link between glial cells and inflammation. So, microglial cells are sort of we used to say they're the macrophages of the brain, but they're immune cell lineages. They play an essential role in the development of the brain in utero. They support, we think of them as supporting brain health when things are quiescent. When inflammation occurs in the body, they can be activated. There's still a lot of debate, though, about whether that activation, whether they're the real bad guys or whether it has to do with signals coming in from immune cells in the periphery or immune cells that actually cross the blood-brain barrier. But the tie with inflammation and glial cells is really tight. So for instance, we know that one of the things in animal models, at least, that inflammation in the body does is that it signals astrocytes to sort of reverse they have a glutamate reuptake pump, the sort of cycling of glutamate and GABA. And generally astrocytes sort of seem to function like vacuum cleaners, right? They surround synapses and they keep the glutamatergic signaling within the synapse, regulate it. They don't let it spill around because glutamate's hot and toxic, and but inflammation actually reverses that reuptake pump so that the astrocytes will actually spew glutamate out into the extracellular space. And one of the really intriguing findings and ideas is that when that happens, there's actually NMDA receptors, not just within the synapse, but extrasynaptically. So, right, NMDA receptors within the synapse, when they're stimulated, they do this thing through AMPA, but they basically sort of drive BDNF production, and sort of that's how long-term potentiation happens. But when the astrocytes reverse their polarity, spew the stuff out, the glutamate interacts with these extrasynaptic NMDA receptors. They have the opposite effect. They actually turn off BDNF. So, it's a way, the end result of that is that things get taken offline. And this has never been proven, but my little evolutionary theory is that they do that as a way to avoid pathogen manipulation, right? So if you look at the areas of the brain that are most susceptible to sort of changes with inflammation, they're areas that have a lot to do with decision-making and behavior. And we know, one of the great underestimated sort of things that goes on in this interconnected world is that pathogens can drive host behavior for their own benefit. Certainly, toxo is a classic example of that, where it seems to change human behavior. Where that's sort of an evolutionary dead end, kind of a spandrel. They didn't even, but you see that, and I think one of the things we'll find over the next 50 years is that some of the things we think we're doing are not us as our central nervous system. It's us. We're like the big taxi cab being driven around by the microorganisms. So there's that. And then of course, it's interesting. We're still working. Your buddy and mine, Chris Lowry, and I are continue to work on looking at sort of the impact of some of these ancient practices or some of these bodily based things on immune signaling. And in particular, we're working on, going to submit a paper pretty quickly looking at the effects of heat, hypothermia, in depressed people on immune functioning. And it's really interesting. One of the things that's emerging from that work is that some things that we think of as being beneficial for health actually seem to acutely activate inflammation, or at least activate aspects of inflammation that we generally think of as harmful. Which is really interesting. So one of the things that I've sort of fixated on recently in the world of sort of psychoneuroimmunology is this idea that inflammation may not be all bad, and that especially phasic inflammation may actually do things that are beneficial, and that some of these ancient practices that involve sort of adaptive stressors like exercise, like heat, like fasting, but especially like heat and exercise may actually sort of physically activate parts of inflammation that may then have beneficial effects, right? So this idea that inflammation is always bad, that depression is an inflammatory state, that we should be giving people anti-inflammatories is something I've really moved away from pretty strongly.
That really resonates over here with kind of the perspective about resilience and how to build resilience. I've treated patients who were exercise addicts, and they were tearing down their resilience. So it's kind of acute episodic challenges to the entire system, not just on the glial cell or the, microscopic pathways of inflammation level, but also on the consciousness level, on the existential level. I think really bring more resilience and more capacity.
But this is really interesting. Well, so you see people. You're in Boulder, so no surprise. Right? You see people that are exercising so much that it's damaging them, basically.
Yes.
Right. Exactly. So this is something I've gotten really fascinated by. I've really come to believe in the U-shaped curve. That is, if you asked me to toss out a couple of slogans that mental health would benefit from, U-shaped curve would be right up there, right? Because many of these things, maybe everything in life, but many things, if it's too low, it's a problem. If it's too high, it's a problem. Exercise is a classic example, right? You're right. I mean, the elite athletes, man, they are right on the edge of going south. I mean, a little bit more exercise and they get sick. They're I mean, the reason we talk about exercise as this unqualified good is only because we don't exercise enough, right? We're all down on this side of the curve, but and a lot of things are like that. And it's really, really, you can see that with psychological stress, right? So I've gotten interested in this idea of hormesis, that certain time-limited, measured challenges that are really detrimental at higher levels, at lower levels, essentially can build up resilience, build up strength. We generally think of it as in relationship to that toxin or that stressor. But exercise it's beautiful in so many ways as an exemplar of that, where, if you're really sedentary, you go to pot, psychologically and physically. And if you way overdo it, you go to pod. And then somewhere in there's this sort of level where you're getting enough to maximally function. And what intrigues me is that from an evolutionary perspective, that level is probably fairly consistent with what most humans did across most of evolution, not because how they lived before was perfect, but because organisms that were genetically able to sort of optimize that niche, that opportunity, procreate and reproduce. So, over time, the organism began to match the environment, and if you're having to be active and chase down prey and all this sort of stuff, but then if you undershoot it, you fail. And if you overshoot it, you fail. So it's interesting.
I like the the evolutionary conversation and maybe expanding on that a little around depression. So, as we're seeing, depression's, if not already, going to be the largest global burden of disease on the planet. And I'm really interested, since you've studied a lot about depression in your research, a couple questions. Is depression increasing over time? Is that what we're seeing?
Seems to be.
Seems to be.
Seems to be in some places. In America, for sure, right? In many parts of the Western world. There's other places. There was just a large sort of study that came out, and I wish I could remember where it sort of wasn't increasing. But it tends to increase with modernization, I think, in general. And it, of course, increases with societal stress. No doubt about that. That's a huge effect. But yes, in our lives, both depression and suicide have been increasing for, there's some evidence depression has been increasing for 60, 70 years now. It certainly seems to be increasing in the last 20 years in the United States.
And you've obviously delved pretty deep into biological aspects of depression. And I'm curious your thoughts on, are we facing a major sociological issue? Are we facing an ecological issue here? Or is it all of the above, or a sociological issue?
Yeah, it's all. It's like a kind of a weird perfect storm of things, right? So, and there's probably 100 of them, but it's interesting. COVID has reminded me of data showing that people that are sort of, take your pick on what we mean by this, but people that are sort of lower down, but think that they're looking up, are much more satisfied and happy than people that are up looking down, right? And so, one of the problems with being on top of the world is that it's like being at the North Pole, every direction south, right? If you're on top of the world, there's like many, many pathways down and not very many pathways up, which is sort of, it's like a governor on human happiness, I think in general, many people in our world have this feeling that the best times have passed, or that the future is going to be frightening. And uncertain, and that that we're sort of here looking down, right? And all of us, regardless of our political stripes, whether we embrace it or deny it, are aware of things like climate change, and now COVID, of course, has really screwed things up because our entire world and everything we took to be solid has been shaken apart by something we can't even see. This is going to cause a deluge of mental health problems. So on a sociological level, there's this sort of that sense of, are things going up? Are things going down? If we as a society, as a culture, think that things are going down in some way, generally, that in itself produces hopelessness and depression and fear, right? And then, of course, there's a lot of aspects of the modern world that are useful for commerce, but are sort of depressogenic. A lot of the ways we structure our social support systems, we could talk about that. There's also biological things that I'm really interested in this. So one of the things, again, that Chris Lowry and I have written a lot about is the fact that over the last 60 or 70 years, we've hugely disrupted our relationships with the microbial world, right? And, overall, much to the good, because, prior to, the early 20th century, about half the people ever born were dead of infection by the age of 17. And we now can feel that terror of infection in our life. So it's an evolved horror, right? So the fact that we managed to develop antibiotics, especially, sort of this liberating thing, but along with that, we kind of tossed the baby out with the bathwater, and we have so altered the microbial environment that we've also gotten rid of a lot of things that we co-evolve with and we need to function optimally, right? So this has to do with what the bugs that are inside us, but also the things in the environment around us, We evolved in a world where a lot of microorganisms kind of modulated our immune functioning to reduce inflammation for their own purposes, not because they were trying to be nice to us. They needed to survive in our bodies, and they didn't harm us, or they helped us. We've disrupted so much of that especially on a society-wide level, there's ample evidence that this has produced a rash of autoimmune conditions, allergic conditions, asthmatic conditions, all of which are highly associated with depression. And probably with depression, right? So there's, for instance, there's data that C-sections, which totally changed the infant microbiota, are risk factors for things like depression and behavioral problems. Again, suggesting that we've done this biological thing. Not only have we disrupted our relationship with each other or radically changed them in the modern world, but we've radically changed our relationships with the microbial world. And really, as I always say, to be a human is essentially the essence of human life is to be in relationship with other humans and the bugs and microorganisms. That almost everything in our life boils down to those two, to managing those relationships. And we've so altered all those relationships that we're really showing the wear and tear. We're beginning to get so far away from the inputs that we evolved to need to feel kind of normal and balanced and satisfied, that it's set up this kind of whirlwind of sort of psychological problems.
Speaking of our friends in the microbiome, I remember reading, I was fascinated when the book Epidemic of Absence came out, Moises Velasquez-Manoff, and he was talking about some of the things Dr. Lowry talks about, which is, in particular, this is such a microscopic question, but I'm fascinated to ask you this about H. pylori and sort of this, I think the guy got the Nobel Prize who discovered the pathogenesis of it.
Yep. In terms of ulcers, right?
Ulcers, right. But then we know that the timing, at least, there's a strong association between this massive logarithmic increase in autoimmune asthma, autoimmune diseases in the 70s, around the time H. pylori was just eradicated. And there's some theory of allowing the human immune system to develop along with H. pylori up to a certain point where the risk of ulcers and stomach cancer increases. And then maybe at that point, we should be eradicating H. pylori. I'm just curious your thoughts about allowing these old friends to exist up to a certain level, and then the ones who are going to cause us trouble, maybe we eradicate them later.
Yeah, exactly. So this, you would beforehand, you'd try to ask, like, what are studies that I'd love to see done? A hugely important study in terms of mental health is looking at just this question, right? Of, all right, so, if we're not going to live in a natural world, and the natural world kind of sucked too. I mean, like I say, people are sick, they've died, it was good, but it was bad. It could be improved upon, right? But the way to improve upon it is not to just wipe everything clean. The way to improve upon it is to do exactly what you've suggested, to literally test, maybe children need H. pylori until the age of, on average, 12, and then it should be removed, right? Overall, trying to understand what the developing human organism needs in terms of microbial support and interactions from conception, into adulthood is one of the great, great unanswered questions, I think, because, a lot of us throw probiotics down ourselves as adults, but it's probably kind of a day late and a dollar short. There clearly are real permissive periods in human microbial interactions that occur earlier in life and that nobody really understands and nobody's really studied. They're hard studies to do because you have to follow people for a long time. You have to watch kids grow up. But this is one of the core questions in my mind is, if we're going to live in an unnatural world, how do we intelligently but artificially increase the richness? Don't just do something stupid like kill all bugs, but, do this and then, switch it out. Hepatitis A, same thing, right? So hepatitis A in traditional times was a childhood infection that was pretty mild. And it had really, sort of seemed to have these immunomodulatory benefits, right? But God help you get hepatitis A as an older person in the modern world. And it doesn't kill you, but it makes you wish you were dead, right? So, again, evolution is an imperfect beast. It never produces perfection. That's why we don't live in a perfect world. But it's pretty smart and it's pretty wise. And it has a lot of these interesting redundancies, which make trying to understand how it's working very, very difficult. But, if you're in a situation that you find pretty nice, throwing in odd things and disrupting evolutionary sort of co-evolved sort of interactions is a very dangerous thing to do. There's a lot of roads down, right? If you like the forest, don't go plant a tree from Asia because, if it's got some nasty, sort of invasive species in it, there's a lot of ways to kill the forest, right? And so, we humans had evolved into a space. We were really nicely evolved and regulated into this sort of open space, but it was a space that had a certain kind of lifestyle, it had certain kind of societal, generally social organizations, and certain types of relationships with the microbial world. And it could definitely be improved upon, and we have improved upon it. But all those improvements often come with hidden risks. You see the immediate benefit, you don't see the hidden risk. COVID being the classic example, right? So we think that human interdependency is a great thing and a world culture is a great thing, and it is. But if you don't think about the fact that we're not the only beings in the universe, and if we don't bring microorganisms to the table, we're not going to be able to do it, right? Because we did not evolve to exist in these massive sort of conglomerates that are at high risk from, giant collapses from things like this, right? So again, it's directly relevant to what you're saying. The real answer is it's like a version of that U-shaped curve. It may be that H. pylori is really useful at some points, and then you pay a price for that usefulness that evolution was willing to accept. Maybe we could shave that price off and keep the benefit. That's really what science should be trying to do in general, right?
Yeah, that's I love that sort of symbiotic relationship you're describing of really working with everything around us, but trying to understand the ecology of the human being, so that we can, obviously tailor our existence in the most efficient way, is what I think I hear you talking about. I'm curious, sort of related to this, and you mentioned it, which is, what are if you were able to fast track a handful of research projects, like what are the handful of burning questions you feel like would really propel us forward in the mental health field right now, that getting those answers would really give us some significant headway here?
Yeah. Well, okay. So let me narrow it down to let's just take depression as an example, because that's really kind of what I understand, right? Or let's say the type of emotional misery that, when it reaches a certain level, really impedes people's ability to function, ability to find satisfaction in life, right? So I'm going to set aside things that look more like real illnesses, like bad schizophrenia, right? Or bad bipolar disorder. But if we go all the way up to bad depression, there are a number of things we really need to understand. So the number one is sort of what we've been talking about. And it's not what I do, but it's just, nothing is more important than trying to figure out what we might be able to do early in life to build resilience in adulthood, right? So that people, my chairman of psychiatry at UW-Madison sort of sometimes will say, that we're like oncologists trying to treat everybody we're treating has got stage 4 cancer, is going to die. You want to treat cancer, you want to prevent it first, and then you want to treat it really early on. We don't have any early on treatments yet. That's a whole other story. Meaning that just putting people on antidepressants early on is not necessarily going to help them. But what we do need is the ability to prevent these things, or deal with them early in development, so that people come into adulthood with sort of maximal resilience. That's number one. And so, trying to understand how we can optimize a microbial environment is a classic example of that. And then, of course, then there's all the human social environment. I am not a fan of genetic manipulations, strictly mainly because of what we're talking about. You think you're changing one thing, you end up changing something else, right? So, these forced evolution studies show that you think you're trying to breed for one thing, and you change the way the ears work and the way the face looks, and everything's connected. So much better to sort of build upon evolved human strength, I think, than to try to just willy-nilly rebuild human beings. And then I think, on the other hand, trying to understand how to treat depression once it's started is the other great thing. Now that sounds like, that's like everything in the world. But I say this because one of the really distressing things that I've experienced professionally in the last 5-7 years is the growing realization that although people benefit from our treatments, and thank God we have antidepressants, they come with costs and risk that I had not appreciated, which we could talk about for hours. But basically, the data that if you come to see me as a young man and you're depressed and I put you on antidepressant, the data that by doing that, I do that and you actually feel a lot better. Let's say it actually works. The data that I have now provided you with something that's going to really benefit you across your lifespan are really disappointing. And there's increasing counter evidence that what may be happening is that once you start down that path, you kind of have to stay on it if you want to avoid being depressed again, right? So that you end up sort of becoming this sort of cyborgian creature. It's you and the antidepressant, and every time you try to stop the antidepressant, you get depressed again. The data for that are really distressing to me, right? And this idea, so you think about depression is like this. It's caused by stress, and it is a stressor. And so people come in, and they're at a point in their lives where they're being pushed. And what we do as doctors is, it's the equivalent of you're hot, cool it down. If it's cold, warm it up. We say, how can we make that pressure go away? We're going to take away that pressure with an antidepressant. A lot of times it doesn't work, and that's another problem. But what's gotten me really interested in a distressing sort of way is what happens when it does work. So now I've put you on an SSRI, and all the things that were really bothering you before, you go, I don't know. I feel much better now. It's all worked up. I wasn't getting along in my relationships, but I've got other things in my life, whatever, And so, the problem when, many people find this with antidepressants, the problems either vanish or mitigate. And then you go along and everything is beautiful, until either the antidepressant stops working, or you kind of flatten out, feel dull, or you decide you don't want to be on a pill for the rest of your life and you stop the antidepressant. And people have this high rate of depressive relapse. And Peter Kramer, to his credit, with listening to Prozac back in the 90s, he recognized this, that the things only work when you're on them, right? What he didn't know was that stopping them may be a huge risk factor for worsening your depression, right? So this idea that the way to deal with things is always just to soften it up in mental health may have some real limits. It may have some real applicability, just like antibiotics have costs. Nonetheless, if you're dying of a bacterial infection, by God, you better have an antibiotic. But maybe you don't want to put them in your meat supply, right? In the same way, man, there's times when you just want to take the heat off people, right? But I've gotten hugely interested, like we've been talking about, in this other approach, which is actually adaptive stressors. Are there ways that we can take these episodes and somehow instead of taking it away in a very intelligent, cautious, safe way, push it to the point where there's some sort of breakthrough, some sort of change in you guys were talking about perception and how people look at things in the beginning, some way of changing people's perception or their emotional state, that combination of things, changing it in ways that then make them more adaptive, more resilient, so that they don't need some sort of outside stimulus from something like an antidepressant, but that you've done something pharmacologically or behaviorally or physiologically that then sort of pushes the system, boom, causes a reset, and now they're in a different state. And now they are able to be undepressed based solely on the functioning of their brain-body system. They don't need continuing external input to maintain that new kind of homeostasis, if you want to call it that. Trying to understand whether that's possible, how to do that, and better understanding when and how the costs of just medicating people and calming them down for the rest of their lives. Trying to understand those costs and ways to do the opposite and how to combine them. Something like that, I think, is really going to, those are the studies. If I had like hundreds of millions of dollars, I would strategically fund those lines of research to try to help us, build up our capacity to use these adaptive stressor-based approaches that then, are time limited and set in motion longer-term resilient responses. Try to understand what are the risks and limitations of just medicating symptoms away. And then just like with your pylori thing, how can we are there ways that we can best understand when to just medicate things away for at least a while, and when to use these more adaptive stressor-based approaches? Really, at the end of the day, if I lived long enough and enough money, that's what I would spend my life doing.
Thank you. Wow. It feels like this adaptive stressor model really, really resonates, Keith, with how we're educating people in the fellowship and really inviting people to look at this bigger picture. And that leads me to the question of whether you feel, Chuck, like taking this approach, this more, maybe more informed or more sober approach around psychopharmacology, and with the cognizance that there is a cost, is this something that clinicians need to already be incorporating into their way of working with people at this point in time?
I think, absolutely. So, we started this conversation with, stories from my personal life. So I'll tell you a story from my personal life in this regard. So like all psychiatrists, well, not all, but like many of us, I've struggled with depression. And one of the ironies of my life is that I've spent my professional life in the last 20 years at least trying to find ways to replace antidepressants, while at the same time, personally, I'm like a poster child for these things, man. I mean, if I take an antidepressant, as long as it's got a serotonergic reuptake component, man, I mean, I'm exactly what I described as me, all the things all this sort of subtle and all this stuff, I'm just like, oh man, I just want to do my work and everything's fine. And, it like takes me back to a prepubescent mind state where I'm just excited about projects, and it's great. And I lose these levels of emotional depth, which really sort of bugged me after a while, but, and I get side effects, get sleepy, sexual side effects, but it really is just the damnedest thing to experience this. And now about 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was given a talk in Colorado with one of the great sort of psychiatrists at the interface of the big pharma and psychiatry, a guy named Rakesh Jain, who is he's one of the most remarkable humans I've ever known. He's like a legend. And the more you know him, the more you realize the dude's just a legend. We were walking around the Capitol in Denver, and I started telling him about, I was taking this antidepressant, and he turned to me and he said, "Chuck, that is a bad idea." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Do you know about tardive dysphoria?" And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And he said, "There's evidence that the prolonged use of antidepressants is not good for you. You shouldn't be doing this." And I was, it distressed me, man. It was like one of these transformative experiences where we were talking about consciousness. Well, see, I can see exactly where I was in front of the state capitol. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, "There's increasing evidence that when you take these agents long-term, it's not good for your brain. You don't want to do that." Well, if this guy had been a psychotherapist, or if he'd been this sort of anti-med guy or whatever, I would have been like, yeah. But this guy is probably the most prominent psychiatrist and champion of big-time pharmacology. And so it was really impactful. And so thank you, Rakesh, for setting me off on this pathway where I began to really dig into the literature and begin to find this stuff. So yes, based on that, and Rakesh would tell you the same, that when dealing with depression, what I said, I think really should be now what we do. You don't want to be stupid and withhold antidepressants, but this idea of reaching for them always in a casual way, just to shut up the symptoms, is probably a mistake. Again, I think antibiotics, and there are some things like vaccines, which they're a pharmacologic intervention, but they work by strengthening an already evolved protective mechanism, in this case, your immune system, right? So, vaccines don't go and kill organisms. They're cooler. They basically, the organisms in your immune systems co-evolve together. So there's a strength there. The vaccine works within that co-evolved system to strengthen it. So you don't induce resistance. You don't blow things up because you're not going outside the system, if I could say it that way. Whereas antibiotics, they evolved, for fungus to try to fight off bacteria. They had their own place. We yank them out, and now we use them, and they because we've taken them out of their evolutionary context, they're awesomely powerful, and they rapidly screw up your environment, and they drive all these problems because they drive resistance. They set up compensatory evolutionary moves against themselves, right? Antibiotics and antidepressants, I think, are similar in that way, that their overuse sets up systems where they become perhaps resistant to their effects and produce long-term changes in the ecology that are probably bad. With antibiotics, more generally with antidepressants, perhaps in the ecology of the person's brain-body continuum. So it's not that you shouldn't use them, it's that the overuse is a problem. So I think, anything we can begin to do to help people try these more adaptive stressor type approaches that are more like vaccines. Why does running make you feel good? Running makes you feel good because across human evolution, you probably had to run to chase down your food. You chase down your food, you get to eat, you get to survive, you impress the other tribe members, you got the beast on your back. And if you have a genetic makeup that gives you a hedonic reward from running, you're more likely to run, therefore you're more likely to eat, right? So these are so you take that, you don't need to throw something new into the system. You just can intelligently kind of push that system, and it's already there for you, and you don't set up these opposing evolutionary forces that build resistance. To the degree that we can do these sorts of adaptive stressor interventions, I think they hold real promise. And then I think, just like with antibiotics, you hold the other things in your hand when people really need it because the system is being overwhelmed. You have to basically kill some bacteria for the immune system to be able to handle things. You have to kill some of the stress for the person's, system to be able to handle it. But it would have radically different implications. So, for instance, you might try to treat people with antidepressants at lower doses for a more minimal period of time. Something that, when I was trained, that was like anathema. You do not do that. That's like satanic evil stuff, right?
Yeah.
Well, these are studies that should be done, right? They were never adequately done. We don't know. But this would be the implication of these ideas. And ideas are often wrong. So I'm not, but these are just things we should think about as clinicians. Definitely we should try to foreground wellness-based adaptive stressor type practices into our treatment of patients, and do it seriously enough that it doesn't seem like, oh, by the way, and if you could just exercise a little on the side, that'd be good, right?
Right.
Yeah, as we wrap up, I would love to hear your thoughts on ketamine for depression. And I think anyone that's ever done ketamine knows that there's some work involved if you're going to take ketamine. It's essentially a psychedelic experience that happens. And I'm curious about your thoughts on, would you frame that as sort of an adaptive stressor intervention in a short-term model that can reset, going back to what you were saying earlier, can reset and get people prepared to do some of the more long-term work?
Yeah. So let me say first that I think psychedelics in general are adaptive stressors for many people. That's exactly what they are. They're psychological adaptive stressors, right? Robin Card-Harris, who's the kind of wunderkid of the psychedelic world, has written just brilliant essays on antidepressants that operate primarily perhaps serotonin 5-HT1A receptors that just have sort of produced adaptation to current conditions versus psychedelics and other 5-HT2A receptor agonists, which induce intense experiences that produce behavioral change, right? Instead of just saying, what's the problem? You go, there is a problem and I'm going to deal with it, right? That experience is usually stressful for people. And I don't need to tell you that a lot of people that do psychedelics are in for a surprise. Even when they do it in a very therapeutic context, they have very difficult experiences that they say, thank you, that really helped me. It was horrible. It really helped me. Ketamine, you're right, has that potential, I think, especially at higher doses, especially when taken in a therapeutic setting. And there's a lot of this going on in your town, as you know, and many people are now repurposing ketamine as a sort of available psychedelic modality because, the others are not legally available right now. Ketamine, though, is interesting because, there's also, I think, very credible data, obviously it led to an FDA approval, that for many people that don't respond to other antidepressants, you can give ketamine at lower doses. And people have a little bit of dissociative funkiness, but you can do it with them laying in a gurney and not talking to them and telling them, hey, well, if you feel weird, just try to ignore it, it'll pass, right? People still get these effects. I think ketamine is oddly dual. I can't prove this to you, but I think that at lower doses, it's just an antidepressant, basically, right? And it produces a rapid effect, so it's different than SSRIs, but that's probably purely biological, meaning it probably has to do with different differential rates of driving synaptogenesis and neurogenesis and this sort of stuff. And you can see it in the signal, right? So you do ketamine on average, one dose like that, and people feel better for about a week, right? You do psilocybin at a psychedelic dose one time, and people feel better, depending on the condition, for weeks or months, right? Suggesting that there's sort of a different mechanism. So ketamine, I think, can be either used as just a regular old fast antidepressant or in a more psychedelic-like way. And of course, obviously, unless the higher dose would block the direct biologic effects, and there's no evidence for that, there's much to be said for trying to do it as a psychotherapeutic enhancer. I personally suspect that classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline do not have direct antidepressant effects. I agree with Robin Card-Harris. I think it's going to turn out that they're neuroplastic agents, that they make the brain remarkably sensitive to internal and external context, and that they produce experiences, and the experiences are what drive the change. So as we talked about it, we're actually trying to directly study that. But that's what the data right now would suggest, that they may not be direct You do psilocybin, it's not going to just make you feel happier because of what it does to your brain. It needs to be paired. What it does to the brain may be permissive. It may be necessary for the therapeutic benefits, but not sufficient. And I've got some colleagues that have some early animal work to suggest that both ketamine and psilocybin produce very rapid synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, spine, the brain. Mm-hmm. In the animals, the ketamine has an antidepressant effect, the psilocybin doesn't. And that would be consistent with this idea that there's something about classic psychedelics that need perhaps some level of cortical complexity to be used as antidepressants,
Yeah, thank you. That's super informative. Well, as we wrap up, I'm really curious, kind of the last question. This conversation for most of this podcast audience are providers. Yeah. And then there's some people interested, obviously, just for the things they're dealing with. There's that group too. And this conversation for a lot of providers is sort of like mind blowing, like, oh my gosh, I wasn't thinking about any of this stuff before this moment. And what I'm curious about is for that person that this is really like mind blowing, like there's all these different ways, like where do they get started in terms of, okay, either they're a medical provider or a therapist or whatever, like where would you recommend people get started to start, dealing with this kind of new innovative way of thinking about a patient in relationship to their environment and how to help them in that process?
Right. So this is really a challenge, right? I mean, we there's not, this may just be my ignorance, but there's certainly not very many kind of fully packaged sort of, this is how you do, if you're interested in this idea, this is how you do it, We've been talking about Rakesh Jain. He and his wife, Sandra, have produced an online wellness platform called the Wild 5. If you just Google Wild 5, it's free. It's available, and it combines sort of exercises with physical exercise, mindfulness, sleep hygiene, social connectivity, and mindfulness into a package that is really pretty user-friendly. And that gets at some of these ideas around, like exercise and stuff. Short of that, this is where I always get kind of embarrassed because I wish I had something that I could pull out of a drawer and say, here's a potential package for doing this. But, all these things are available. There's a lot of information available about them. In terms of exercise, psychedelics, I caution people, I go around talking about them as if they're God's gift to mankind. The studies that need to be done to really assure that they work for depression have not been done yet. And so we're always cautious and say that this is a developing thing. On the other hand, ketamine is available, it's legal, and it has antidepressant effects. And, the sort of exploring the use of ketamine as an intervention in a psychotherapeutic setting is something that people can examine now, and that for some people might enrich their practice. I know a lot of people that feel that way. I think if one made a list of things, another thing, obviously, we're still very actively involved in hyperthermic work. And, we use this super fancy, expensive machine in our studies, but I have colleagues that are looking at sort of more widely available modalities. And frankly, there's some data showing that hot baths have antidepressant effects. Try to incorporate phasic hyperthermia into into how people treat things. Is this going to solve all their problems? No, it's not. But we and others have shown it has a clear antidepressant effect. We haven't talked about it, but I'm very interested in intermittent fasting. And there are now some data, especially in older adults, showing that it does have an antidepressant effect. It's something people can try. You don't want to go overboard on it. It's just like the exercise we were talking about. Don't go anorexic. But there's a lot of convergent data that episodic sort of food deprivation has immediate mood elevating effects for many people, and also may have some longer term antidepressant effects. So all these things. One time I did this 16-hour seminar for a huge mental health program system in Southern California. And when I was done, the stage got stormed. People were a little bit pissed off at me. They said, man, lots of really interesting details, but you mean 16 hours at the end of the day, all you have to say is what our grandmother told us? And it's a problem with all this. Yeah, it's kind of it's a version of what your grandma told you, but it's how it's implemented and packaged. People want to feel, for the clinicians, for your patients, they don't want to feel like you say, hey, why don't you go try to exercise? They want to feel like, here's an exercise program. I'm writing a prescription. This is what I expect. This is how we're going to hold you responsible. If you want to do treatment with me, this is use expectations and intention and placebo and all these things to try to make these interventions to honor the fact that they really are powerful. They do have effects, and they can be implemented in ways that feel like you've gone to a doctor. I think finding ways to do that is really key for bringing this into a practice.
Thank you for all that. That's really helpful. And I just want to thank you for everything you've focused on so diligently in your career, your research, and you're just making such huge impact on a massive ongoing question and problem around, if we even just focus on depression, like the impact you're bringing to that conversation is just so large. I just really want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate the kind words and great questions, guys. We've probably said everything I pretty much know about, but I'll be happy to come back sometime if we can reiterate.
We'd be happy to get you back. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, it was really good. I enjoyed it.
Well, thanks for being on the show.
Sure.
Thanks.